Walt Emerson stood in the parking lot of his own company at 6 in the morning, staring at a padlock that hadn't been there the night before, bolted straight through the front doors of Emerson Millwork. His phone buzzed. A text from his business partner of 11 years, Dennis Cray. Board voted 3 minutes to last night. Emergency meeting. You're on administrative leave pending the audit findings. Nothing personal, Walt. Numbers are numbers. Walt read it twice, his breath fogging in the cold morning air, 30 years of sawdust and second mortgages standing locked behind a door he'd installed with his own hands. He didn't know yet that the auditor Dennis had quietly hired to bury him, the one Dennis had waved off in a board meeting the week before as just some junior nobody. She won't find anything worth finding, was the same 26-year-old woman currently pulling into the parking lot behind him in a rental car, carrying a laptop bag and 11 years of unanswered questions about her own father's death. Her name was Callie Reyes, and she was about to find out exactly how much Dennis Cray didn't want her looking. If you believe the people who get underestimated are usually the most dangerous ones to underestimate, stay with me, because this one earns that. Subscribe now so you don't miss where it goes. Walt was 61. 22 years earlier, his younger brother Marco had died in a car accident on an icy bridge, leaving behind a 15-year-old daughter and no other family willing or able to take her. Walt had been building Emerson Millwork out of a rented garage bay at the time, barely solvent, raising his own son Tyler alone since his wife's death 2 years before that. He didn't think twice. Callie moved in that same week. He gave her Marco's old toolbox, the one thing left of her father's that meant something, and told her the same thing he told Tyler every single day growing up in that house. Nobody in this family gets left to figure it out alone. Callie grew up in that shop as much as in that house, sanding boards on weekends, learning to read a blueprint before she could properly drive, absorbing something from Walt she'd carry the rest of her life. When she left for college at 18, she chose accounting, telling Walt only that she wanted to understand, really understand, how the numbers behind a business actually worked, because she'd watched him nearly lose everything twice in her childhood to bad partners who understood the paperwork better than he did. Remember that sentence? She wasn't studying accounting to leave the family business behind. She was studying it to protect it. Dennis Cray had joined Emerson Millwork as a financial partner 9 years earlier, buying in with capital Walt desperately needed to expand into commercial contracts. For years it worked. Dennis handled the books, the banks, the board. Walt handled the craftsmanship, the crews, the clients who trusted his handshake more than any contract. What Walt didn't know, what almost no one at the company knew, was that Dennis had spent the last 3 years quietly routing overbilled contracts through a shell vendor he controlled personally, skimming a percentage off every large commercial job before it ever hit the company's real books. Small enough at first not to notice. Large enough, 3 years compounded, to have created a hole that was about to become impossible to hide, right as 2 of the company's largest contracts were coming up for their annual audit. Dennis needed someone to blame before the numbers surfaced on their own. He'd spent months quietly building a case that the discrepancies traced back to Walt's own long-standing habit of handling smaller client jobs off the books, in cash, as favors to long-time customers who couldn't always afford full invoices. The same generous, informal way Walt had run half his business for 30 years without ever once profiting from it personally. It was a real habit. It was also, Dennis had realized, the perfect thing to frame as fraud. Callie had been working at a mid-sized forensic accounting firm for 4 years, specializing in exactly this kind of contract auditing, when her firm was hired at Dennis's specific request to conduct Emerson Millwork's annual review. Dennis had pulled her file before approving the assignment, seen her last name, and felt a brief flicker of concern before dismissing it. Reyes was common enough, and even if she was connected to Walt somehow, she was junior, unremarkable on paper, easy to steer toward whatever conclusion the engagement letter suggested she look for. He had no idea Callie Reyes had grown up in that shop. No idea she still had her father's toolbox in her apartment closet. No idea that when she walked through those doors for the first time in 8 years, she recognized the smell of sawdust and machine oil before she recognized a single face. She recognized Dennis immediately. He didn't recognize her at all. "Miss Reyes," he said, shaking her hand in the lobby, his tone the practiced warmth of a man used to charming auditors into asking easier questions. "We appreciate you taking this on quickly. I think you'll find the irregularities are pretty contained once you look closely. Small stuff. Cash jobs, mostly Walt's doing honestly. Old habits? I'll look at everything, Callie said simply. Dennis smiled. Of course, though between us I wouldn't expect much. It's a straightforward case. He walked away without noticing that Callie's hand had tightened slightly around her laptop bag, or that her eyes had lingered a half-second too long on a photograph, still hanging in the hallway, Walt, younger, standing beside a 15-year-old girl, and a toolbox that had once belonged to a man named Marco Reyes. For 2 weeks, Callie worked quietly through the company's financial records, saying little, drawing no early conclusions, exactly as she'd been trained to do. She found the cash jobs Dennis had pointed her toward almost immediately, small, informal, entirely consistent with the reputation she remembered Walt having her whole childhood, generous to a fault, never once skimming a dollar for himself. What she also found, 3 days later, buried in a vendor account with a name she didn't recognize, was a pattern that didn't match anything Walt would have done. Payments routed to a company with no physical address, no employees, no history beyond receiving money and forwarding a fraction of it somewhere else entirely. She traced the account slowly, carefully, the way her training had taught her, building a paper trail instead of a theory. It took her 9 more days to connect the shell vendor definitively to an account controlled by Dennis Cray personally. By the time she finished, she had 3 years of documentation, clean, dated, and irrefutable. She had not yet decided what to do with it when Dennis called an emergency board meeting and had Walt locked out of the building the very next morning. Walt sat in the company's small conference room 2 hours after finding the padlock, having been let in only because Callie herself had called the building manager and insisted, flashing her auditor credentials to get the door open. I don't understand, Walt said quietly, staring at the administrative leave notice in his hands. 30 years, Dennis. You're doing this over cash jobs I've been doing since before you ever bought in. Dennis, seated across the table with 2 board members flanking him, kept his voice smooth. The audit findings speak for themselves, Walt. I didn't want this. But the numbers are the numbers. Then let's look at the numbers, Callie said, walking in and setting her laptop down at the head of the table without waiting to be invited. Dennis's easy expression flickered just slightly. Miss Reyes, this is a board matter. I appreciate your work, but the preliminary findings are already. The preliminary findings aren't finished, Callie said. I'd like the room to see the complete report before anyone signs anything. She opened the laptop and turned the screen toward the board members. Dennis's confidence held for exactly as long as it took her to reach the 3rd slide. The room went quiet as Callie walked through 3 years of transactions, dates, amounts, the shell vendor's formation documents, the account routing that traced, cleanly and without ambiguity, back to Dennis Cray's own name. This vendor has no employees, Callie said. No physical operations. It exists to receive a percentage of overbilled invoices on large commercial contracts and forward the remainder to an account controlled personally by Mr. Cray. I have 3 years of documentation. I'd be happy to walk the board through every transaction individually, or you can review the full report yourselves. Dennis stood abruptly. This is absurd. She's a junior auditor. This is exactly the kind of overreach I warned the board about. I've been doing this for 4 years, Callie said, calm, not raising her voice. And before that, I grew up in this shop, Mr. Cray. You might not remember me. I was 15 the first time I sanded a board on that floor downstairs. Walt Emerson raised me after my father died, in a house where nobody was ever left to figure things out alone. So when you told me 2 weeks ago that this was a straightforward case, and that a junior nobody like me wouldn't find anything worth finding, I want you to understand something clearly. You didn't just underestimate an auditor. She looked at him steadily. You underestimated his daughter. The room stayed silent for a long moment. One of the board members quietly closed the folder in front of him. Another looked at Dennis with an expression that had shifted entirely and permanently from trust to something colder. Dennis's voice, when it came, had lost all its earlier smoothness. Walt, this is a misunderstanding. I can explain the vendor relationship. It's not what it looks like. Then explain it, Walt said quietly, the first thing he'd said in several minutes. Because right now, my whole life is sitting locked outside a building I built with my own hands, and the only person in this room who's told me the truth is the girl I raised. Dennis had no answer that survived the silence that followed. The board voted that same afternoon, unanimously this time, to remove Dennis Cray from his position, pending a full criminal referral. Walt's administrative leave was reversed before the day ended. The shop reopened the following morning, Walt unlocking the same front door himself, this time with nothing standing in his way. Callie stayed 2 extra weeks, finishing the full audit properly, making sure every dollar was accounted for and every finding held up beyond challenge. The same careful, patient work Walt had once watched her do with a blueprint at age 16. On her last night before returning to the city, she found Walt in the shop after hours, running his hand along a workbench that had been in the family longer than she had. "You could have told me who you were the first day," Walt said. "Would have made things a lot faster." "I thought about it," Callie admitted. "But I figured if I said it out loud too early, it might look like I couldn't be objective. I needed the numbers to speak first. You taught me that. Read everything to the very last word before you sign anything or say anything." Walt looked at her for a long moment, something thick in his throat. "Your father would have been proud of the woman you turned into." "He didn't raise me," Callie said quietly. "You did. Every bit of who I am in that boardroom today, that's you. I just did the math." A year later, Emerson Millwork opened a small in-house financial transparency office, run part-time by Callie, who now consulted for the company alongside her regular firm, making sure no partner would ever again be able to hide 3 years of numbers behind a shell account. Tyler, Walt's son, stood beside her at the shop's anniversary gathering that spring and told the assembled crew a short version of the story, ending simply with the line his father had said to both of them their entire childhood. "Nobody in this family gets left to figure it out alone," Tyler said. "Turns out that includes the company too." Walt, standing at the back of the room in the same work boots he'd worn for 30 years, watched Callie laughing with the crew she'd once sanded boards alongside as a teenager, and understood fully for the first time that the toolbox he'd handed a grieving 15-year-old girl all those years ago had never really been about the tools at all. Some debts get repaid in ledgers. Some get repaid in courtrooms and boardrooms, in numbers laid out clean and undeniable on a screen. And some simply get repaid the way they were given in the first place, quietly, without anyone needing to keep score. If this one reached you, tell us in the comments about someone who turned out to be far stronger than anyone gave them credit for. Welcome to Heartverse. We're glad you're here.